A House Divided Cannot Stand. Author, Othniel Max Daves. Introduction, Stand in Unity. As I reflect on the warnings of presidents throughout history, my mind inevitably turns to one of the most profound and biblically grounded cautions ever issued by a leader of this nation. Abraham Lincoln, in the early days of his political career, issued a warning that would echo through the ages: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." This phrase, drawn directly from the words of Jesus in the Gospels, was not just a clever metaphor. It was a clear biblical truth, an insight into the very nature of unity, division, and the fate that awaits a nation torn by conflict. Lincoln first delivered this warning on June 16, 1858, in his acceptance speech for the Illinois Republican nomination for United States Senate. The country was in the throes of a growing crisis over slavery, a crisis that had seeped into every corner of American life, dividing families, communities, and the nation itself. Lincoln saw this division as unsustainable and feared that the country could not endure as half slave and half free. In his mind, the issue of slavery was not one that could be compromised or quietly contained. It was a moral and spiritual crisis, one that required a reckoning. He chose his words carefully, knowing that this phrase, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," would resonate deeply. It carried the weight of Scripture, the authority of Jesus' own teaching, and it signaled to the audience that Lincoln's view of the issue transcended politics. To Lincoln, this was about the very soul of the nation. He saw that a country at odds with itself on such a fundamental moral question was, in essence, already tearing itself apart. At the time, Lincoln's words were controversial, even alarming. His opponent, Stephen A. Douglas, accused him of inciting division, of taking an uncompromising stance that could provoke conflict. But Lincoln knew that to stay silent on this matter would be to allow the rot of division to fester, to permit a fundamental wrong to go unchallenged. He believed that the issue of slavery was too corrosive to the nation's spirit to be brushed aside or managed through half measures. He knew with a deep moral clarity that a reckoning was inevitable. Lincoln's warning was rooted in the biblical understanding that division on essential truths cannot be sustained indefinitely. Jesus, when he uttered these words in the Gospel of Matthew, was speaking to the nature of unity and integrity, to the idea that anything fundamentally divided against itself, whether a kingdom, a house, or a nation, cannot survive for long. Lincoln saw this spiritual truth mirrored in the political and social reality of his time. The United States, he realized, could not remain both a champion of liberty and a protector of slavery. To do so was to be fundamentally divided against itself, to live in contradiction with its founding principles. As history unfolded, Lincoln's warning proved prophetic. The nation's divisions became unbridgeable, leading to the Civil War, a conflict that would test the very fabric of the American experiment. Lincoln's words were not merely predictive. They were a challenge to the nation to confront the fundamental contradiction at its heart. He urged the country to recognize that its identity, its mission, was incompatible with the institution of slavery. The Civil War was, in many ways, the fulfillment of his warning, a brutal, violent reckoning that ultimately required bloodshed to resolve the conflict that had torn the nation in two. Lincoln's vision was, in many ways, anchored in the biblical understanding of justice, freedom, and the inherent dignity of every human being. He saw slavery as a moral blight that had to be eradicated for the country to survive as a unified whole. But he also recognized that this unity was not something that could be forced or fabricated. It had to be earned through a commitment to truth, to justice, and to the principles that the nation claimed to uphold. His understanding of a house divided was not merely political, but deeply spiritual. Lincoln believed that America had a moral obligation to align itself with what he saw as divine truth. In his later years, Lincoln would reflect on the nation's struggle with a theological depth that went beyond political rhetoric. He came to see the Civil War as a form of divine judgment, a consequence of the nation's moral failings. In his second inaugural address, he would state, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him?" In these words, we see Lincoln's conviction that the conflict was a reckoning, a consequence of the nation's failure to heed the biblical call to justice and human dignity. Lincoln's warning, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," remains a timeless call to us today. It is a reminder that unity cannot be built on compromise with fundamental wrongs, that a nation cannot survive when its soul is split between opposing moral visions. We face our own divisions, our own crises of integrity, and Lincoln's words continue to challenge us. Are we willing to confront the truths that divide us, to seek unity in a commitment to justice and to principles that transcend mere politics? In many ways, Lincoln's biblical warning is as relevant now as it was in 1858. A divided nation cannot stand. A people torn by moral and spiritual contradictions cannot endure without consequence. We must recognize that these divisions, if left unaddressed, will lead to their own reckoning. And like Lincoln, we must find the courage to face these truths head on, with a vision for unity that is not about avoidance or appeasement, but about aligning ourselves with the timeless principles that have guided us from the beginning. His words call us to confront our own moral divides, to seek healing not through compromise with wrongs, but through a courageous commitment to what is right, what is just, and what is true. We have today too many who have been deceived by dark forces into lives of division, not only externally against one another, but also within themselves. This division is insidious, tearing at the very foundation of our convictions and fragmenting our loyalties. Just as a house divided cannot stand, neither can a soul withstand the forces that seek to control, manipulate, and corrupt it when that soul is split within itself, torn between truth and falsehood, between courage and fear. This internal division is not merely a personal struggle, it is a spiritual fracture that weakens the fabric of our entire society. When individuals are divided within, uncertain of where their loyalties lie, hesitant in their convictions, half committed to what is right, they become vulnerable to forces that do not wish them well. They become easier to sway, easier to silence, and easier to shape into mere extensions of a system that cares nothing for truth or integrity. And as it is with individuals, so it is with the nation. A nation built on ideals of freedom and justice cannot endure when those very ideals are compromised. When people within that nation lose their unity of purpose, when they lose their allegiance to the truths that once bound, them together they become easily manipulated by forces that thrive on division and control. A divided nation, just like a divided individual, becomes susceptible to decay from within, allowing external forces to infiltrate, corrupt, and ultimately destroy what was once whole. These dark forces understand the power of division, both within and without. They know that if they can pit individuals against themselves, they have already weakened the defenses against their greater schemes. They seek to create doubt where there was once certainty, confusion where there was once clarity, and isolation where there was once community. And they have succeeded in convincing many that to stand alone, to waver, to retreat into self-preservation is the way forward. But this only leads to deeper division, to more profound vulnerability, and to a collective weakness that opens the door to forces that wish to dominate and devour. We must recognize this tactic for what it is. The division within our own hearts is as dangerous as the division we see among us. It leaves us disoriented, without the foundation of conviction needed to stand firm. If we are divided in our own beliefs, if we allow our loyalties to be compromised, then we become mere shadows, lacking the strength to resist, lacking the will to stand. And this fragmentation, once it takes hold within us, spreads outward, seeping into our relationships, our communities, and ultimately into the soul of the nation itself. Now is the time to reclaim that unity of purpose, both within ourselves and with one another. To resist these dark forces, we must first align our hearts and minds, dispelling the illusions that keep us uncertain, uncommitted, and afraid. We must decide, individually and collectively, to stand for truth without compromise, to anchor ourselves in conviction, and to reject the influences that seek to divide us against ourselves. Only with that inner unity can we hope to rebuild a unified nation. Just as a person cannot stand when their heart is split, a nation cannot withstand the pressures of external forces when it is divided within. We must remember who we are, reclaim our allegiance to what is just and true, and stand unshaken, both as individuals and as a people bound by common principles. For in that unity lies our strength, our resilience, and our hope to withstand the forces that would see us divided, weakened, and conquered. Let us find that strength together, binding our hearts in truth and reclaiming our convictions. For only a house built upon such a foundation can endure. In the face of silence, in the shadow of censorship, and amid a culture that seems bent on erasing the power of truth, and a notation that has been divided against itself by external and internal forces, I find myself compelled to speak louder, to press forward, and to call to you who feel the weight of this age pressing down upon your own heart. My words, my warnings, and the visions I've shared are not merely the products of observation. They are drawn from the well of history, echoing the wisdom of our founding fathers. The final cautions of presidents who foresaw the fragility of this nation, and the enduring truths found in Scripture and across the ages. I am not alone in this. The voices of those who came before us resound in harmony with my own, each of them urging us to recognize the forces at play, forces that work subtly yet relentlessly, to silence, to divide, to mold us into passive participants in our own subjugation. They warned us to be vigilant, to guard our integrity, to protect our unity, and to remember that freedom comes not just through words, but through action, through courage, and through an unwavering commitment to truth. Yet here we are, watching as voices are silenced, as truth is de-amplified, as complicity is rewarded, and dissent is punished. My work, my words, have faced the same forces, censored, ignored, even denigrated, yet they persist because they resonate with an enduring reality, one that cannot be erased. What I have spoken, what I continue to share, is not a call to comfort, but a call to awaken, to recognize the machine that seeks to devour, the spirit of the age that would have us yield piece by piece, compromise by compromise, until we forget what we stood for at all. This moment, this struggle is a test of our will, our convictions, and our courage to stand in defiance of forces that seek to diminish and divide us. This is the challenge our founders anticipated, the very challenge that each departing president warned us would come. And it is not enough to see it. We must face it, we must resist it, and we must rise above it. I call to you now to overcome the fear that binds, to break the silence that stifles, and to step beyond the comfort that would keep us passive. This is not merely a fight for today. It is a stand for tomorrow, a declaration that we will not be molded by faceless systems, that we are not products to be managed, but individuals created with purpose, living with conviction. In this, we honor the warnings of the past and fulfill our duty to those who will come after us. We are here to live, to speak, to stand, not as people of the world, shaped by its demands, but as people in the world, bearers of a truth that is unbreakable and eternal. Together, we choose to be more than silent witnesses to our own decline. Together, we are the defiant voices, the unyielding lights, the enduring keepers of a legacy that no machine, no spirit of the age can ever devour. And so, I ask you to join me, to stand with me, in the face of the forces that seek to silence, enslave, and devour. For in this stand we find our strength, our purpose, and the path forward. Let us walk it together, not in fear, but with courage, with conviction, and with an unshakable resolve that even in this age of shadows, truth will prevail. As I stand here echoing the truths I've shared and urging you to see what lies before us, I can't help but think of the presidential farewell addresses that marked the end of each leader's journey, those final words spoken with a gravity born of experience. These were more than goodbyes, they were urgent warnings, a final attempt to impress upon us the forces that could undo this nation from within. From Washington to Eisenhower, Truman to Reagan, these leaders looked into the future and saw the very trials we now face. George Washington, in his parting words, urged us to avoid the seductive pull of division and faction, to beware the dangers of political parties that could pit us against one another. He knew that once we allowed ourselves to become fractured, our strength as a nation would weaken, our unity would become a memory, and we would be left vulnerable, not just to foreign powers, but to internal corruption, to forces willing to exploit our own blindness. Today, his words resonate as we watch society grow increasingly polarized, a people divided, each side seeing the other as the enemy rather than as fellow citizens bound by shared ideals. Eisenhower, in his departure, warned us of a different kind of danger, a military-industrial complex that, left unchecked, would expand its influence, embedding itself in every corner of our lives, quietly shaping policy, economy, and even culture. It wasn't simply the growth of defense spending he feared, but the merging of corporate power with government, the rise of a faceless machine that would prioritize control over integrity, profit over public good. In many ways, we see this warning manifesting now, not only in defense, but across every industry, as corporate power aligns with political machinery, each reinforcing the other in a cycle of influence that renders individual voices small and silent. Each farewell address, in its way, sought to prepare us, to remind us that the greatest dangers would often come not from without, but from within, through apathy, complacency, and our willingness to yield to forces that promise comfort while demanding compliance. Truman spoke of the importance of civil liberties, warning that in our efforts to protect ourselves, we must be careful not to surrender the very freedoms that define us. And Reagan, optimistic though he was, reminded us that freedom must be defended continually, that without vigilance it can slip away quietly, almost imperceptibly, as we slowly acclimate to each new restriction, each quiet compromise. These presidents knew that freedom is a fragile thing, not guaranteed but earned and preserved through deliberate choices. Their warnings were not simply relics of another era. They were prophetic, seeing forward to a time when we would face the same struggles they sought to prevent. And now here we are, watching as silence replaces discourse, as corporate influence overshadows public voice, as fear keeps people from speaking the truths they know. I see my own warnings as an extension of theirs, a continuation of this unbroken line of caution that has been passed down through the generations. And yet, in our time, It seems that these voices have been diminished, disregarded, as though we believe ourselves immune to the very threats they described. But we are not immune. We are in the thick of it. The faceless machine they feared is here, in the form of a culture that values conformity over conviction, a society where voices are suppressed, not by overt force, but by quiet social pressures, by a spirit of the age that tells us to comply, to fall in line, to avoid rocking the boat. Each of these presidents, in their own way, urged us to remember what truly matters, to hold fast to principles, to refuse to let comfort outweigh integrity, to live as people who are not molded by the demands of the moment, but anchored in truths that endure. This is the call I echo now. Their words, their warnings live on in my own, and I find myself standing in the same current, facing the same pressures, and speaking out not only because I must, but because the future depends on it. We are the inheritors of their wisdom, but only if we choose to heed it. Only if we choose to see these farewell addresses not as historical curiosities, but as living documents, guides to navigating the very challenges they foresaw. They saw this path we're on, and they urged us to turn back, to resist, to choose courage over complicity. They left us with the tools we need: truth, vigilance, and the courage to stand. It is up to us now to take up those tools, to heed their words, and to walk forward with eyes wide open, unafraid to be the voices that will not be silenced. This is our moment to honor their legacy, to show that their warnings were not in vain, that we are not simply products of this world, but people called to live in it with integrity, with purpose, and with an unbreakable commitment to truth. Let us rise to this call, not for ourselves alone, but for those who will follow, who will look back and see whether we chose to heed the warnings given to us or allowed ourselves to be swallowed by the very forces they sought to save us from. This is our stand, and in it we honor the past, defend the present, and safeguard the future. Contemplating the warnings of presidents. Analyzing presidential farewell addresses across American history reveals recurring themes and warnings to the nation, many of which reflect concerns about unity, foreign entanglements, economic stability, moral integrity, and the preservation of democratic principles. Reviewing these addresses reveals patterns where the country failed to heed these warnings, resulting in significant social, political, and economic consequences. Below is an analysis of notable farewell addresses and the impact of not following their advice. 1. George Washington, 1796. Warning: Washington's farewell address is perhaps the most prescient, urging the young nation to avoid entangling alliances, resist sectionalism, and beware of political parties' divisive potential. He stressed the importance of religion and morality as foundations of civic virtue and warned against excessive national debt. Consequences of failure. The entanglement in foreign conflicts, particularly throughout the 20th century, has led to costly wars and interventions, from world wars to Vietnam and Iraq. Political parties became increasingly polarized, a problem Washington feared, leading to severe sectionalism by the Civil War and ideological entrenchment in modern times. Accumulating national debt, a consistent reality since the 1980s, now threatens economic stability and national sovereignty. 2. Andrew Jackson, 1837. Warning: Jackson warned of the dangers of monopolistic power, specifically targeting banks and corporations gaining too much control. He expressed concern that these entities could undermine democracy and exert undue influence over government. Consequences of failure. By allowing monopolistic corporations and financial institutions to grow, the U.S. faced repeated financial crises and a concentration of wealth that contributed to severe inequality. The Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, and modern corporate lobbying reflect the dangers Jackson highlighted. 3. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1961. Warning: Eisenhower's famous warning about the military-industrial complex cautioned that the intertwining of defense contractors and government could erode democracy and divert resources from social welfare. Consequences of failure. The military-industrial complex has grown enormously, often driving U.S. foreign policy and entrenching defense spending at the expense of domestic needs like infrastructure, healthcare, and education. This influence has contributed to costly interventions abroad and a weakened social safety net at home. 4. Lyndon B. Johnson, 1969. Warning: Johnson warned of the impact of social inequality and racial injustice, stressing the need for continued progress on civil rights and poverty reduction. He cautioned against divisive politics that would reverse these gains. Consequences of failure: persistent racial and economic inequality have fueled social tension and political polarization. The failure to fully address civil rights and economic disparity has resulted in recurring civil unrest and deepened divisions along racial and socio-economic lines, as seen in movements like Black Lives Matter and the social crises following 2008's economic downturn. 5. Jimmy Carter, 1981. Warning: Carter focused on the need for a society grounded in ethics and responsibility. Consequences of failure. The focus on consumerism has driven environmental degradation and economic instability through debt-driven growth models. America's ongoing energy dependency has also exposed it to international crises and climate challenges, as well as domestic economic vulnerabilities. Reagan, while optimistic about America's future, emphasized the importance of American values, family, faith, and freedom. He also warned of the government's potential to encroach on individual liberties. Consequences of failure. A retreat from core values and a growing distrust in institutions have marked the post-Reagan era. The tension between personal freedoms and government oversight has intensified with issues like mass surveillance, eroding the balance Reagan highlighted. 7. Bill Clinton, 2001. Warning: Clinton warned about the dangers of polarization and stressed the importance of community, shared responsibility, and global engagement in an interconnected world. Consequences of failure. Rising polarization and tribalism, both within the U.S. and in its approach to foreign policy, have created an increasingly divided society and strained international relationships, making bipartisan solutions to issues like healthcare, immigration, and national security nearly impossible. 8. Barack Obama, 2017. Warning: Obama warned against the erosion of democratic norms and values, particularly the challenges of racial tensions, economic inequality, and the dangers of misinformation. He emphasized the need to strengthen democracy and civic engagement. Consequences of failure. Misinformation and polarization have reached unprecedented levels, impacting elections, public health, and social cohesion. Economic inequality and racial tensions persist, contributing to public disillusionment with democratic institutions and amplifying division and extremism. Consolidated analysis of consequences. Across the spectrum of these farewell addresses, recurring themes are evident. When these warnings were ignored or inadequately addressed, the following broader impacts emerged. 1. Polarization and division. Almost every president foresaw the dangers of factionalism, which has culminated in extreme polarization, fracturing American society into ideologically isolated communities. This division weakens national unity and diminishes the collective problem-solving capacity. 2. Military-industrial influence and foreign entanglements. The U.S. has engaged in prolonged conflicts that reflect the militarized approach Eisenhower cautioned against. Such involvement drains resources from domestic welfare and strengthens a cycle of dependency on defense spending. 3. Economic and social inequality. Persistent warnings about economic inequality reflect a profound concern for social cohesion. Ignoring these warnings has contributed to a loss of upward mobility, creating a permanent underclass and leading to social unrest and political instability. 4. Environmental degradation and resource dependency. The failure to heed warnings on sustainability, particularly around energy dependency, has not only heightened geopolitical vulnerabilities but also positioned the U.S. as a leading contributor to environmental degradation. 5. Erosion of democratic norms and civic virtue. Warnings about the need to protect democratic values and norms resonate today as trust in institutions declines. Failing to uphold these values has led to the erosion of accountability, respect for institutions, and the rule of law. Rise of corporatism and monopolistic influence. The corporate influence that Jackson and other presidents cautioned against is evident in the overwhelming power of technology and finance corporations today. This corporate concentration limits competition, stifles innovation, and contributes to inequality. Beyond the most frequently discussed addresses, several other presidents offered critical warnings in their farewell speeches that illuminate further recurring themes. Here's an analysis of additional presidential farewells and the impacts of ignoring their counsel. Thomas Jefferson, 1809. Warning: Jefferson expressed concern over sectionalism, particularly the divisions between the North and South. He cautioned that these regional divides could destabilize the Union. Additionally, Jefferson warned against foreign alliances that could entangle the U.S. in conflicts. Consequences of failure. The Civil War eventually erupted due to the intense regional divides Jefferson identified, leading to profound loss, enduring tensions, and a legacy of inequality and sectional bias that continues to impact American society. U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts over the years, contrary to Jefferson's ideal of limited alliances, has often brought unintended repercussions, from regional conflicts to broader wars. James Madison, 1817. Warning: Madison emphasized the importance of constitutional restraint, warning against executive overreach and stressing that each branch of government must respect constitutional limits to prevent tyranny. Consequences of failure. Over time, executive power has expanded significantly, often bypassing Congress through executive orders or emergency declarations. This imbalance has led to controversies over presidential authority, weakening the checks and balances Madison emphasized as essential for preserving democracy. 11. James Monroe, 1825. Warning: Monroe's farewell address reinforced the Monroe Doctrine, cautioning against European interference in the Americas. He also highlighted the importance of national unity and warned of potential threats from abroad. Consequences of failure. While the U.S. generally maintained Monroe's stance on foreign influence in the Americas, it also engaged in its own forms of imperialism, creating resentment in regions like Latin America. This legacy has impacted diplomatic relationships, trust, and political stability in the Western Hemisphere. 12. Calvin Coolidge, 1929. Warning: Coolidge underscored the importance of fiscal responsibility and warned of the risks of speculation and financial irresponsibility. He advocated for small government and cautioned against reckless economic practices that could destabilize the economy. Consequences of failure. Coolidge's warnings were unheeded as the speculative bubble of the 1920s expanded unchecked, culminating in the Great Depression. This catastrophic economic collapse led to massive unemployment, poverty, and a lasting distrust of financial institutions. 13. Harry S. Truman. Warning: Truman spoke about the dangers of the Cold War, warning that the ideological conflict with the Soviet Union should not lead the U.S. to compromise its democratic principles at home. He emphasized the need for vigilance without sacrificing civil liberties. Consequences of failure. The Cold War era saw significant infringements on civil liberties such as McCarthyism and surveillance practices, which damaged public trust in government and led to a climate of fear and suspicion that has had lasting effects on political discourse and civil rights. 14. Richard Nixon, 1974. Warning: though tainted by scandal, Nixon's farewell address included an acknowledgement of the dangers of unchecked executive power and the importance of public trust in government. Consequences of failure. The Watergate scandal itself eroded public trust significantly, and subsequent abuses of power by executive leaders have continued to deepen public skepticism toward government. This ongoing erosion of trust contributes to political disillusionment and apathy. Gerald Ford, 1977. Warning: Ford spoke to the nation about healing from the divisions of Watergate, emphasizing the need for honesty, transparency, and bipartisanship to restore faith in government. Consequences of failure. Although Ford's call for healing was genuine, the trend of political scandal and partisanship continued, culminating in an increasingly polarized political environment that has compromised the nation's ability to work across the aisle on critical issues. 16. George H.W. Bush, 1993. Warning: Bush warned of the risks of isolationism and called for the U.S. to remain a compassionate, engaged global leader. He also stressed the importance of civility and humility in leadership. Consequences of failure. America's oscillation between isolationist and interventionist policies has led to inconsistent foreign policy approaches, contributing to complex relationships and international instability. The lack of civility in politics that Bush warned against has only grown, further alienating the public from the political process. 17th. William Howard Taft, 1913. Warning: Taft warned about the risks of judicial overreach and the importance of an impartial, apolitical judiciary to uphold the Constitution. He feared that politicizing the courts could weaken their role as an independent check on power. Consequences of failure. Increasingly politicized judicial appointments have led to perceptions of partisanship within the Supreme Court and lower courts. This has weakened public trust in the judiciary and led to court decisions that appear to align with political rather than purely legal reasoning, undermining the judicial branch's impartiality. 18. Woodrow Wilson, 1921. League of Nations to prevent future world conflicts. He warned that rejecting global cooperation could isolate the U.S. and lead to further conflicts. Consequences of failure. The U.S. rejection of the League of Nations arguably weakened global peace efforts, contributing to conditions that led to World War II. Later, despite joining the United Nations, the U.S. often approached international cooperation ambivalently, leading to tensions with allies and inconsistencies in foreign policy. Warning: Wilson focused on internationalism, particularly advocating for the 19. John Quincy Adams, 1829. Warning: Adams expressed concern about the rise of partisan politics and how it could detract from principled governance. He warned that prioritizing party allegiance over the national interest would weaken democratic institutions. Consequences of failure. Partisan politics have indeed led to an environment where party loyalty often supersedes the common good, undermining collaboration, legislative progress. and public confidence in political leadership. 20. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1945. Warning: in his fourth and final inaugural address, Roosevelt addressed the need for international cooperation post-World War II and the importance of addressing domestic inequalities to create a more united society. Although not a formal farewell, it was a powerful final address to the nation. Consequences of failure. Failing to adequately address economic and racial inequalities has led to recurring social and economic unrest. Additionally, challenges in global cooperation during the Cold War and beyond created geopolitical tensions that persist today. Broader implications. The added analysis reinforces several recurring patterns. Presidents consistently identified these dangers, many of which remain unaddressed, leading to the following overarching impacts. 1. Institutional distrust. A common theme is the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. As presidents warned against executive overreach, partisanship, judicial politicization, and corruption, the lack of reform in these areas has significantly diminished public faith in government. 2. Escalating polarization. The warnings from Adams, Washington, and others about political division have proven remarkably accurate. The nation's divisiveness has deepened, creating a cultural rift that hampers progress and destabilizes democratic discourse. 3. Economic inequality and corporate influence. Repeated warnings about economic fairness and corporate power remain largely unheeded, leading to increased economic disparity and monopolistic practices. This has restricted social mobility, concentrated wealth, and contributed to a sense of alienation and resentment among many Americans. 4. Challenges of global engagement. Presidents who warned against isolationism and called for principled global engagement, such as Wilson, Bush, and Jefferson, outlined the necessity of thoughtful foreign policy. However, inconsistent approaches have led to unanticipated conflicts and weakened alliances, with implications for national security and global stability. Diminished civil liberties. Several presidents, including Truman, emphasized the importance of preserving civil liberties. However, periods of surveillance, authoritarian measures, and restrictions during times of perceived crisis have compromised the balance between security and freedom. Contemplative reflections. Presidential farewell addresses form a tapestry of counsel rooted in the lessons of each leader's tenure. The warnings these presidents shared are not confined to the past, but resonate with relevance for the present. As America has ignored or selectively applied these cautions, the resulting societal impacts mirror many of their predicted consequences. The cumulative effect is a nation grappling with deep-rooted challenges that many of its leaders foresaw, urging a reflection on these foundational principles and a reconsideration of how to address them in modern governance. Collectively, the farewell addresses of U.S. presidents serve as a map of potential pitfalls on the path to national maturity. These speeches reveal a continuity of concerns that transcends partisanship and offers insights into America's systemic challenges. When these warnings are ignored, the country tends to repeat cycles of social upheaval, economic instability, foreign overreach, and democratic decay. Presidents' farewell addresses should be revisited not only as historical artifacts, but as living documents offering guidance and principles that remain as relevant today as they were when first spoken. The warnings of past presidents echo profoundly in today's America, where the divisions and struggles the nation faces seem to fulfill their predictions. The fault lines, political polarization, social inequality, economic instability, diminished trust in institutions, and the erosion of civic norms are not merely crises of governance. They are also a test of the nation's resilience, a test that challenges the very core of American identity and the ideals upon which the country was founded. This test has elements of both internal weakness and external threat, combining to challenge the United States in a way that resembles both a crucible and an assault on the democratic experiment itself. 1. Political polarization and the rise of tribalism. Presidents from Washington to Clinton cautioned that unchecked factionalism and political parties would undermine unity and foster sectionalism. Today, that polarization is not only a political divide, it has deepened into a cultural and ideological split, fostering a sense of us versus them that threatens the cohesive identity of we the people. This division has reached a level where basic truths, historical facts, and democratic norms are contested within echo chambers, leaving little room for the common ground essential to democratic governance. This polarization is both a test and an attack. It tests Americans' ability to engage across differences with integrity, humility, and respect, as Ford, Bush, and Obama advised. It also reflects a more insidious attack on democracy from within, as ideological silos and misinformation fracture the social fabric, leaving the nation vulnerable to manipulation, both internally and externally. 2. Social and economic inequality as a root of division. Many presidents, including Jefferson, Johnson, and Carter, warned that social and economic inequality would threaten the country's unity and stability. This reality is perhaps more pronounced today than ever before. Wealth disparity has grown exponentially, leaving the middle and working classes feeling abandoned and frustrated, a fertile ground for resentment and social unrest. Economic hardship, particularly as wealth concentrates in the hands of a few, divides society along class lines and deepens regional and racial inequalities, fueling populist anger and undermining faith in the American dream. This growing divide is not only a societal failure, it is also a test of America's commitment to justice and equity. The divisions caused by inequality weaken democratic resilience, as people turn to tribal loyalties or ideological extremes to protect their interests. At the same time, these disparities are a vulnerability that foreign adversaries can exploit, as they amplify these divides through disinformation and influence campaigns, seeking to destabilize and weaken the nation from within. 3. The erosion of civic trust and institutional integrity. Madison, Nixon, and Truman each highlighted the importance of upholding institutional trust and warned that undermining civic faith would weaken the democracy itself. In today's America, trust in government, media, and institutions has eroded to a dangerous degree. This erosion not only creates a vacuum where misinformation thrives, but also removes a key pillar of democratic strength: belief in the rule of law and fair governance. The collapse of trust represents a test of the nation's ability to reform and renew itself from within. It requires leaders willing to act transparently, address corruption, and restore accountability. But it also signals an attack as hostile actors, foreign and domestic, seek to exploit the public's cynicism. When trust erodes, divisions become entrenched, and the collective will to address shared challenges wanes, making the country vulnerable to manipulation and division. 4. The influence of corporate power and economic disparities. The warnings of Jackson, Taft, and Coolidge about the risks of monopolistic corporate power and economic speculation feel particularly resonant today. Major corporations exert unprecedented influence over policy, technology, and even social discourse, often prioritizing profit over public good. The unchecked power of these entities has created a society where economic influence overshadows democratic accountability, widening the gap between corporations and the average citizen. This reality tests Americans' willingness to reclaim economic power and address corporate overreach through regulation and reform. It also acts as an attack, as concentrated power often leads to economic instability and weakens the resilience of local economies, leaving communities vulnerable to exploitation and neglect. The dominance of a few megacorporations in technology and media, also enables external influence, as foreign entities can manipulate information or even shape public opinion through corporate channels. 5. Civil liberties and surveillance as a double-edged sword. Presidents like Truman and Carter warned of the risks posed by sacrificing civil liberties in the name of security. Today, Americans live under a constant state of surveillance with a delicate balance between privacy and security. The emergence of mass surveillance and data collection poses a unique test, whether America can safeguard personal freedom and uphold civil liberties without compromising national security. This compromise represents both a test and a form of internal attack on democratic ideals. The tools designed to protect can also be weaponized, eroding individual rights and stifling dissent. This creates a society where fear and caution inhibit open dialogue and democratic participation, which adversaries can exploit, taking advantage of America's preoccupation with security to drive wedges further. Certainly. Continuing from where we left off. 6. American internationalism and the burden of global leadership. Presidents like Wilson, Eisenhower, and George H.W. Bush warned about the complex demands of global leadership, urging America to avoid the extremes of isolationism and overreach. Today, America finds itself tested on the world stage, where its role as a global leader is simultaneously challenged and expected. On one hand, many Americans feel weary of foreign entanglements and the cost of maintaining international alliances, while on the other hand, global instability, from regional conflicts to the rise of authoritarianism, demands a steadying presence. This is both a test and an attack. The test lies in America's capacity to engage with the world in a way that reflects democratic values without overextending its resources or compromising domestic welfare. The attack comes in the form of adversarial nations, seeking to exploit America's reluctance or fatigue, filling the vacuum left by a retreating us, and in doing so, spreading influence in ways counter to democratic ideals. The nation's handling of its role in international affairs thus becomes a critical pivot, impacting both national security and the global balance of power. 7. Civic virtue and the fabric of society. Many presidents, from Washington to Reagan, spoke of the moral foundation required to sustain democracy, emphasizing virtues like humility, responsibility, and respect for shared values. They viewed civic virtue as essential to the health of the nation, warning that its erosion would lead to selfishness, decadence, and ultimately social collapse. Today, the struggle between individualism and communal responsibility is stark, with social media, consumerism, and identity politics reinforcing self-interest at the expense of the common good. This is fundamentally a test of character for American society. Can the nation reclaim a sense of shared purpose and mutual respect, or will it descend into further fragmentation? It also acts as a cultural attack, as the forces of hyper-individualism and materialism erode the nation's connective tissue, isolating people within their own silos. This inward focus makes the country susceptible to division and creates fertile ground for ideological extremism, as well as for foreign powers seeking to exploit these fractures to weaken the nation's unity. 8. The fragility of democratic norms in civil dialogue. The warnings of Adams, Ford, and Obama about the fragility of democratic norms resonate deeply in today's divisive climate. The disregard for these norms, such as respect for free speech, tolerance for differing opinions, and adherence to procedural justice, has led to a combative environment where political opponents are viewed as existential threats rather than fellow citizens. The rise of cancel culture, ideological purity tests, and refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue reflects a dangerous erosion of civil discourse. This is both a test of American democratic resilience and an invitation to manipulation. The test lies in the nation's ability to preserve its democratic traditions, such as open debate, compromise, and respect for dissent. Simultaneously, adversaries exploit these divisions by sowing disinformation and amplifying extremism on both sides, seeking to fracture the nation's social cohesion and weaken its ability to address shared challenges. 9. Distrust in the judicial system and the erosion of justice. Taft and other presidents stressed the importance of an impartial judiciary as the foundation of a stable democracy. Today, however, the judicial system is increasingly perceived as politicized, with public confidence in the courts waning. When legal decisions are seen through a partisan lens, the rule of law itself is undermined, creating a situation where justice appears selective rather than blind. This is both a critical test and an attack on the principles of fairness and equality before the law. The test is whether Americans can reform and restore faith in a judicial system that serves all citizens equally. Meanwhile, the erosion of judicial trust can be exploited by adversaries who amplify narratives of injustice and bias, pushing citizens toward disillusionment and disengagement, thus weakening the democratic foundations. 10. Balancing security with freedom. As Truman and subsequent presidents warned, there's a delicate balance between maintaining national security and upholding the freedoms that define American identity. In today's environment, this balance is frequently challenged by threats from terrorism, cyber attacks, and domestic extremism, which push the government toward more invasive surveillance and data collection practices. While security measures are necessary, they often come at the cost of individual freedoms, creating a pervasive sense of unease and distrust. This balancing act is both a test of America's commitment to its foundational ideals and a potential vulnerability. The test is whether the nation can secure itself without compromising the freedoms it promises its citizens. Simultaneously, adversaries exploit America's internal surveillance debates by spreading misinformation and creating suspicions about governmental intentions, further eroding trust and fostering resentment against the state. 11. Cultural and moral cohesion. Presidents like Jefferson, Carter, and Reagan spoke to the necessity of a shared cultural and moral foundation to sustain the republic. Today, that foundation is strained, with divergent worldviews and competing moral frameworks driving a cultural divide. Issues around identity, religion, gender, and morality increasingly reflect a fractured society where individuals feel disconnected from shared values and history. This divide is both a test of societal resilience and a target for exploitation. Can America find a unifying vision that respects its diversity while fostering a collective identity? This division is also an avenue for cultural subversion, as adversaries highlight and intensify cultural clashes, exacerbating internal tensions and undermining the sense of a unified national purpose. Concluding reflections testing America's identity and strength. The issues America faces today are not simply the product of internal division or external antagonism, but a convergence of both. The warnings from presidential farewells were prophetic in identifying weaknesses that, if ignored, would lead to existential challenges. These issues are now tests of America's resilience, adaptability, and commitment to its founding ideals. 1. Resilience in unity. America is tested in its ability to rise above factionalism and find common ground, to rally around shared challenges rather than fracture under pressure. Unity is no longer an option, but a necessity for withstanding both internal strain and external threats. Commitment to principles. Each farewell address highlighted a commitment to democratic principles, freedom, justice, equality, and integrity. This era is a test of whether America will prioritize these principles or succumb to expediency and division. 3. Adaptation in leadership. The crises today call for leaders who can bridge divides, instill trust, and guide with vision. As each president advised, the nature of leadership matters, and the nation's ability to nurture principled, inclusive leaders will determine its ability to meet these challenges. 4. Resistance to manipulation. As hostile powers seek to exploit divisions, America must remain vigilant, fostering a society that can resist manipulation by upholding media literacy, civic engagement, and critical thinking. Ultimately, these challenges act as both a test and an attack on what it means to be American. They challenge the nation to find new ways to live up to the ideals articulated by its founders and reinforced by generations of leaders. In the face of polarization, inequality, and eroded trust, America's response will define not just its future, but its very soul. If the nation can meet these tests, it may emerge stronger and more unified, renewing its democratic promise in a manner that honors the prophetic wisdom of those farewell addresses. But if it fails, the divisions and vulnerabilities will continue to deepen, leading to a fractured and diminished nation. In my writings, in my talks, and in every warning I've issued, I've spoken truths that are ancient, rooted in the wisdom of the founding fathers, echoing the farewells and final appeals of presidents who foresaw the fragile balance of this nation. These truths go deeper than politics. Beyond the noise of today's arguments, they touch on universal principles, eternal values that, if ignored, only set the stage for further collapse. But what happens when such truths are de-amplified? When voices like mine are censored, banned, ignored, or even openly mocked and denigrated? I am not speaking from a position of mere opinion. My assertions have foundation firm and steady in the timeless words of the founders, who knew the risks of division and the price of letting go of virtue. These warnings have been articulated by presidents across centuries, by people whose lives were shaped by seeing and knowing firsthand the cost of unchecked power, of relentless factionalism, of ideologies that erode the essence of what it means to live freely and in unity. My message aligns with theirs not out of convenience, but because the truths they saw then are the same truths we confront now. They are biblical, they are spiritual, and they are enduring across time and space, universally recognized by cultures that understand what it means to build and protect a society. Yet these warnings go unheard. These insights are stifled, dismissed as inconvenient in a world that values comfort over hard truths, where comfort breeds indifference, and indifference gives birth to collapse. So here we are, witnessing the unraveling, the consequence of suppressing, wisdom for the sake of preserving illusions. People choose to ignore that every society, every empire, every nation that denied these principles has met the same end. And so they disregard, discredit, and drown out voices like mine, hoping that perhaps silencing the truth will make it go away. But truths like these are not silenced. They may be ignored, censored, hidden from the mainstream, but they do not die. They are spiritual and immutable, woven into the very fabric of existence. They are there in the warnings of prophets, in the teachings of scriptures, and in the reminders from every great thinker who understood that without a foundation of virtue, unity, and genuine pursuit of justice, a society cannot endure. I speak these truths because they are not mine alone. They belong to all who came before me, those who warned, who sacrificed, who suffered, and who endured to pass down the knowledge of what sustains us. To disregard these principles is not just to defy history, it is to defy the spiritual order itself, to resist the natural laws that govern the rise and fall of civilizations. They can de-amplify, censor, ban, and ridicule, but it changes nothing of the truth's endurance, and I will continue to speak it, not out of pride or defiance, but out of a solemn understanding that there are truths too important to leave unsaid, even if they are denied, even if they are forgotten. Because the day may come when, amidst the rubble of what could have been, people will remember. And it is my hope, my belief, that when that day comes, these warnings will serve as a guide to rebuild, not just structures and systems, but the spirit of a people who once valued truth above all else. This should be a sign to you, a clear indication of the forces that work not only upon you as individuals, but upon this nation as a whole. These are not merely social, political, or economic tensions. They are deeper currents, unseen yet undeniable, pressing down with purpose. They manifest in censorship, in the silencing of voices that call us back to our foundation, in the denigration of principles that once anchored us as a people. This resistance is not accidental, nor is it the product of mere oversight. It is intentional, deliberate, and it flows from forces that understand the power of truth, yet seek to suppress these forces, work in opposition to the values that establish this nation, values forged from hard-won wisdom and upheld by leaders who saw, who warned, and who tried to prepare us. Forces of distortion and division work to make us forget, to fragment us from within, to steer us away from what is solid, just, and eternal. I speak as a witness, yet not alone. My words are echoes, my voice a continuation of countless others who have stood against these tides, who have seen the struggle in different forms across ages and lands. And now, here, we see it again. This testing, this trial, this spiritual and societal assault upon the essence of a nation, upon the soul of its people. If this sign is ignored, if these forces are left unrecognized, they will not relent, for they are not forces that operate in half measures. They aim to dismantle from within, to erode the memory of who we were meant to be, replacing truth with a shallow, ever-shifting shadow of comfort and compliance. But if this sign is seen, if the presence of these forces is understood, then the path forward becomes clearer, even if harder. It becomes a choice, not to surrender, not to fracture, but to unify in pursuit of that which is unbreakable, to stand in the enduring truths that time and trial cannot destroy. This is not merely a call to awareness. It is a call to action, to vigilance, and to a restoration of vision. For as long as these forces exist, so too does the power to resist them, to expose them, and to reclaim the identity and purpose we are being pulled away from. The silence surrounding my work and the unwillingness of others to stand beside me publicly bring to mind the warnings that so many presidents, from Washington onward, left us in their final words to the nation. Their farewells were not casual. They were delivered with the urgency of those who understood, from hard experience, the forces that could unravel us from within. Each of them saw, from different vantage points, the dangers of unchecked power, of division, of fear-based silence, and the subtle but corrosive pull toward conformity and passivity. In my own words, in my own warnings, I find myself echoing those very concerns. Like Washington, who cautioned against the divisive grip of political factions, I see how people today are held captive to narratives they fear questioning. Like Eisenhower, who foresaw the danger of an unchecked military-industrial complex, I recognize that these forces aren't limited to defense. They reach deep into our culture, our communities, and even our private thoughts, conditioning us to accept their reach and retreat into silence. And like Truman and Reagan, who called us to vigilance in safeguarding our freedoms, I am watching as those very freedoms slip quietly out of reach, not because of overt force, but because of our own choices to remain silent, to comply, to avoid the risk of standing openly for the truth. When people hesitate to speak, to share, or to align publicly with what they know to be right, they enact the very dynamics that each of these leaders warned us against. Each act of silence, each retreat into comfortable compliance, feeds into a system that thrives on obedience, making us not the defenders of truth, but its captives. The warnings these presidents left us were not merely historical footnotes. They were signals meant to resonate, meant to prepare us for times like these, when we would be tested not just by external threats, but by internal pressures to conform, to yield, to let go of our convictions for the sake of safety and comfort. This is the sign of our times, a time when the foundational principles they warned us to protect are being challenged, not in grand battles, but in the quiet choices we make every day to either stand for truth or remain silent. Each warning they left us was a call to vigilance, to courage, and to unity in defending what we hold sacred. They understood that the most insidious attacks are the ones that infiltrate silently, altering who we are without us even realizing it, turning us from citizens into subjects, from people of conviction into people of convenience. I find myself in line with their vision, not because I sought to echo them, but because the truths they spoke are as relevant now as they were then. This silence, this unwillingness to speak openly, is more than a test. It is the very manifestation of the forces they warned us would come. And if we don't recognize it, if we don't answer this challenge with clarity and conviction, then the freedom they fought to protect and the principles they upheld will fade, one silent concession at a time. We are each called to stand, not only for ourselves, but for the sake of those who came before us and those who will come after. The warnings of the past are present now, living in our choices, our words, our silence. It is time to decide whether we will heed them or surrender to the forces that seek to remake us in their image. The weight of these warnings presses heavily upon us, and I feel that weight personally, as each word I've written, every truth I've spoken, has met the very resistance those presidents anticipated. We were given clear counsel to beware the allure of passivity, to guard against the forces that would erode our unity, and to be vigilant in protecting the integrity of our nation, our principles, and ourselves. And yet, here we stand at a moment when those very principles are being tested in subtle, quiet ways that mask their true danger. This isn't a battle fought with arms or grand speeches, but in the daily choices to stay quiet, to look away, to choose comfort over conviction. The attacks come from within as much as from without, chipping away at our courage, pulling us toward division, and urging us to ignore those who would call us back to truth. What these leaders saw, and what I see, is that when we yield in these small ways, when we tolerate manipulation or allow ourselves to be swayed by fear, we become complicit in our own undoing. It is a slow, corrosive process, but left unchecked, it unravels everything we hold dear. Our founders, our leaders, even voices throughout Scripture. They warned us that the greatest threat would come not from foreign invaders, but from our own willingness to surrender our principles inch by inch in exchange for security, acceptance, or ease. We were cautioned against this tendency to choose short-term comfort over enduring truth. Yet here we are, witnessing a society shaped by self-interest, by the need to avoid discomfort, by a subtle yet powerful pressure to conform. And now as I continue to speak out, I find myself standing in the same current they foresaw, a current that seeks to drown out those who would remind us of what truly matters. This isn't just about me, it's about a nation that once valued dissent, that prized truth even when it was inconvenient. Every act of self-censorship, every time we turn away from defending what we know to be right, we feed the very forces that seek to weaken us. We are becoming, as they warned, a people of the world, molded by its shifting demands and controlled by its arbitrary standards, rather than people rooted in timeless principles, in truths that transcend the tides of popular opinion. The choice before us is clear. and it's one our ancestors faced before us. To live in this world, to engage with it fully, yet refuse to be shaped by its demands. This is the choice our presidents urged us to make, the choice our faith calls us to make, and the choice I am calling us all to make now, to stand, to speak, and to reject the temptation to yield. If we are to honor the wisdom of those who came before us, if we are to live in line with the ideals that founded this nation and the truths that ground us as individuals, we must resist. Resist the pressure to conform, to silence ourselves, to let convenience dictate our convictions. We must remember that every time we choose truth over comfort, every time we choose courage over fear, we are answering the call of those who warned us, who prepared us, and who knew that this test would come. This is our moment to prove that we are more than spectators to our own decline. We have the choice to reclaim what we've lost, to honor the warnings we were given, and to ensure that the truths we hold sacred remain intact, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will look back and see how we responded when tested. This is not just a challenge, it's an opportunity to affirm who we are and what we stand for, to draw from the strength of those who spoke before us, and to fulfill the duty we owe to those who will come after. In this, we answer not only to the voices of the past, but to the demands of our own conscience, to the deeper eternal truths that call us to live as people of integrity, resilience, and purpose. This is the path of being in the world, but not of it. A path of courage, conviction, and unyielding commitment to truth. Let us walk it boldly for ourselves, for our nation, and for the timeless principles we are entrusted to uphold. If we are to walk this path, we must do so with the knowledge that it will not be easy, nor will it be without sacrifice. The forces we face are not passive, they are relentless, determined to shape us, to break our resolve, to make us yield in 1,000 small ways until we no longer recognize the values we once held sacred. This path requires us to stand with eyes wide open, fully aware of the costs and the pressures that will come against us, yet resolute in our refusal to surrender to them. We must remember that every step we take in standing for truth is an act of defiance against those forces that would see us silenced. Each time we choose to speak, each time we refuse to compromise on principle, we become living testimonies to the warnings of the past, affirming that we are willing to fight for the values upon which this nation was built. We are not simply protecting words on paper, we are defending the soul of a nation, a soul rooted in the conviction that truth, liberty, and justice are worth the struggle. This is the test our founders knew would come. They understood that a nation rooted in freedom would always be threatened by those who sought to control it, whether through force, manipulation, or the quiet erosion of its foundational principles. They knew that the greatest challenge would not come from armies on our borders, but from within, from our own willingness to compromise, to give in to ease, to sacrifice what is right for what is safe. Their warnings were clear. If we allow ourselves to be molded by the world, we will lose the very essence of who we are. Yet, standing firm in the face of these pressures is more than a political act. It is a spiritual act, a commitment to something higher, something eternal. This is where the call of faith intersects with the call of country, where being in the world, but not of it, becomes a way of life, a standard by which we measure our actions and our choices. We are called to live by principles that are unyielding, principles that are not swayed by popular opinion or shifting cultural tides. These are the same principles our leaders spoke of, the same values that prophets, sages, and spiritual leaders across time have upheld. To truly be in the world but not of it, we must be willing to confront the discomfort, to face the isolation that comes with standing apart, and to accept that there will be those who do not understand, who will misjudge, Who will even condemn? But this, too, is part of the path. It is the price of freedom, the price of integrity, the price of living in alignment with truths that transcend time, truths that are worth more than any comfort this world can offer. We are not alone in this journey. We are supported by the voices of those who came before us, by the wisdom of those who warned us, and by the enduring power of truth itself. For truth, once recognized, cannot be erased. It persists, it endures, even when buried, even when ignored. It calls to us, challenges us, and reminds us that we are part of something greater, something unbreakable. We are bound by this responsibility, not out of obligation, but out of a deep understanding that to betray these principles is to betray ourselves, to surrender not just our rights, but our very essence. Let this be our stand. Let this be the generation that refuses to yield, that answers the warnings of the past with action in the present. Let us be the ones who hold fast to the foundation laid by those who came before, who carry forward the torch of truth, liberty, and justice with unwavering resolve. This is our duty, our calling, our privilege, to be in the world as lights in the darkness, unwavering in our commitment to truth, unafraid to speak, unwilling to compromise, and unyielding in our pursuit of a future grounded in the principles that define us. For in this stand, we are more than citizens of a nation. We are guardians of a legacy, protectors of a heritage, and keepers of a truth that transcends us all. We are the embodiment of the very warnings we were given, living testimonies to the resilience and strength that freedom demands. And so we move forward, resolute, knowing that as long as we remain in the world, but not of it, as long as we stand for what is true, there is hope, not only for us, but for generations to come. In this commitment, we find our strength, our purpose, and our path. This is the stand we take, the stand we must take for ourselves, for each other, and for the enduring truths that bind us all. Let us walk it with courage, with conviction, and with an unshakable belief that in choosing truth, we choose life, we choose freedom, and we choose a future that honors all who came before us and all who will come after. Let this be a call to you, every one of you who feels the weight of fear, who senses the pressure to remain silent, to fall in line, to offer complicity to a faceless machine that seems too vast, too powerful, and too entrenched to resist. This machine, this spirit of the age, does not merely wish to control. It exists to silence, to enslave, and ultimately to devour. It feeds on fear, thrives on our isolation, and grows with every act of compliance, pulling us into a cycle of submission and dependence until we forget who we are. But I urge you now to remember, this machine has no true power over those who refuse to yield their souls to it. Its strength lies in the illusion that we are helpless against it, that we are isolated, that resistance is futile, and yet that very belief is its weakness. For as long as there are those willing to stand, as long as there are voices willing to speak truth, as long as there are people willing to step beyond the shadows of fear, its reach is limited and its influence is fractured. To overcome this spirit of the age, we must first recognize it for what it is, a force that is designed to break the spirit of humanity, to turn us against each other, to drain us of hope, and to make us complicit in our own subjugation. It is not a force that can be fought with passivity or polite dissent. It is a force that requires us to make a clear and deliberate choice, to either stand in defiance of its demands or to slowly surrender ourselves to its influence, piece by piece, until nothing is left. This is not the time for half measures, for whispered complaints, or for silent resentment. This is the time for courage, the kind of courage that steps forward, that rejects the lies, that refuses to be intimidated by the machine's size or its apparent power. For as great as it appears, its true weakness lies in its reliance on our compliance. Without our fear, without our silence, without our complicity, it begins to lose its hold. The machine cannot devour those who refuse to be consumed, who refuse to be turned into cogs within its faceless mechanics. It cannot silence those who speak boldly, who carry truth as a shield, and who are willing to face whatever consequences may come. And it cannot enslave those who remember that their freedom is not something granted by systems or institutions, but something rooted deeply in the human spirit, in the very essence of what it means to live with integrity and courage. I am calling you to overcome the fear that binds you to this machine, to recognize the faceless spirit of the age for the devourer that it is. Its purpose is not to help you, to guide you, or even to protect you. Its purpose is to diminish you, to take away your voice, to reduce your existence to a number, a product, a mere function of its own desires. It will take everything you have if you let it, your freedom, your individuality, your conscience, and finally, your very sense of self. To resist this, you must embrace the courage that has been latent within you, the strength that has been dulled by years of conditioning, the conviction that has been quietly silenced by an endless barrage of demands to conform, to comply, to submit. This spirit of the age will tell you that resistance is useless, that you are alone, that your defiance means nothing. But hear this, your defiance means everything. Your courage, your willingness to stand is exactly what it fears most. The time has come to break free from the chains of forced complicity, to reject the tyranny of silence and conformity. We must reclaim our voices, our thoughts, our hearts, and our will to live not as slaves to a system, but as free individuals created with purpose and dignity. We must rise above the fear that keeps us compliant, above the doubt that keeps us silent, and above the isolation that keeps us feeling helpless. This machine, this spirit of the age, is nothing compared to the power of a people united by truth, a people who refuse to be silenced, a people who understand that they are bound together not by fear, but by a shared conviction that life, freedom, and integrity are worth every sacrifice. We are stronger than it would have us believe, braver than we often allow ourselves to be, and more resilient than it can comprehend. Stand with me. Stand against the faceless powers that seek to silence, enslave, and devour. Stand in the knowledge that to resist is not just an act of courage, it is an act of profound faith, a declaration that we are not machines, not numbers, not products, but people. We are here with purpose, with a calling, with a destiny that no machine, no spirit of the age can ever erase. So I call to you now. Rise above the fear. Resist the call to complicity. Find your voice and use it. Break the silence and let the truth resound. Refuse to bow to a faceless system that sees you as expendable. And instead, hold fast to the truth that you are here in this moment to stand as a testament to the power of a people who refuse to be broken. For in this stand we find our strength, we find each other, and we find the path forward. Let us walk it together, unwavering, for ourselves, for each other, and for all who will come after. As for people, so too for the nation.